Today I'm going to walk you through a chocolate recipe by a very popular French chef. I'll also translate the recipe for you into English and thoroughly test it so you can enjoy it too. Hello, this is Chef Zach Townsend with Dallas Chocolate Classes in Dallas, Texas. I'm a chocolatier and the French to English translator of 18 cookbooks published worldwide. The French have created a great deal of what we know in the world of pastry, and there's a lot to learn from them and their expertise. This is my third video in this series in which I introduce you to a French chef and their chocolate recipes and translate their recipe and techniques for you into English. This video features Ludo Van Rompu and his dark chocolate mousse, so I hope you enjoy it and learn something new. Let's watch the video. Ludovic Van Rompu is rather new on the scene in French pastry. In 2018, he was winner of France's hit TV show The Best Pastry Chef, which is the country's equivalent to the very famous Great British Baking Show. His name is Ludovic, but he goes by Ludo. He was a physics teacher who was passionate about baking and turned that passion into a new career. In fact, he says he never opened a pastry book in his life until 2010. He's now authored books based on his YouTube series, and he has a great website in which he does live workshops, has links to his YouTube videos, and is on other social media as well. If you want to follow him, I'll place his social media on screen for you. Ludo is another great source for techniques in baking and chocolate. You can see on the screen here his chocolate tart, and I plan on translating that one as well for a video, so be sure to watch out for that. But let's take a look at his chocolate mousse recipe. Now for his recipe, Chef Ludo has included dark chocolate, cream, eggs, and sugar. Now he describes this recipe as a low sugar recipe. So what we have to consider then is the chocolate that is chosen if we want to maintain that same characteristic of the chocolate mousse. Now he has chosen a 70% cacao dark chocolate. So dark chocolates, you have to remember, have no particular minimum standards, and therefore a large range of percentage cacaos could be labeled dark. Generally, dark chocolate is considered to have no dairy, have a fairly high percentage cacao, and be intense in flavor. With no dairy, a good quality 70% cacao dark chocolate would contain two ingredients: cacao, sometimes referenced as cocoa or cocoa beans, and sugar. This means that the sugar content would be 30%. So as you select various percentage cacao dark chocolates, the quantity of sugar will move up and down as well, so you have to keep that in mind. So the first step in the recipe is that the cream has to be heated, and Chef Ludo's first tip is that the cream should be at a minimum of 30% milk fat. So he's suggesting that you should avoid using any dairy with less fat because it will prevent the mousse from holding properly. In other words, being too soft once the mousse is refrigerated and set. So in my translated version of the recipe, I typically default to a 36% milk fat heavy whipping cream, which is common in grocery stores in the US, but you can use a cream that's available to you at no less than 30% milk fat. This adjustment in the milk fat content will change the richness of the mousse a little bit, but not by too much. Now the cream at this point is brought to a boil, and the cream is brought to a boil or this high of a temperature because the chocolate is left in a solid form. So the cream has to be hot enough to melt the chocolate. Now, Chef Ludo is explaining here a little bit more about his choice for a 70% cacao dark chocolate. He's making a recommendation that you always use a high quality chocolate, such as a couverture, or one that contains minimum ingredients, as I mentioned earlier, for intensity and interesting natural flavors. He's also talking about avoiding using milk chocolate in the recipe because it not only brings along too much sugar, but in the ratios of the particular recipe, this would cause the mousse not to set properly, or in other words, be too soft. Once you start introducing a much higher quantity of milk fat into the chocolate, this changes the texture of the chocolate significantly, which would then impact your mousse's texture as well. So the cream is poured over the chocolate, and he's discussing here that it's best to always chop the chocolate plus give it a few seconds to begin melting. Remember that chocolate melts just below body temp, so it doesn't take it too long in the hot cream to begin melting. If for some reason your cream does cool down too much, You can just place the bowl in the microwave and very gently heat it to finish melting the chocolate. Now, mixing chocolate with cream is called a ganache, and ganaches are emulsions, and emulsions are a proper mixture of fat and water. So be careful when boiling the cream to bring it just to a boil, and don't let it boil too long, or otherwise some of the important water needed in the recipe will evaporate and potentially break your ganache. I have several videos that go into more depth about emulsions and ganaches, so I will link those in the description. So now you can see the ganache is made, and it's just a simple vigorous blending to create a smooth and creamy texture. The ganache is now allowed to cool down some, and he's mentioning here that by the time you finish the meringue, which is the next step, and it's incorporated into the ganache will have cooled down to about 40 degrees Celsius or just above body temperature. So now it's time to make the meringue, which is simply egg whites beaten with sugar. So you need to separate the yolks from the whites. Now, because these whites are going to be beaten to stiff peaks, you need to ensure that there are no traces of the yolk or any other fats present in the egg whites, because that will prevent the egg whites from beating properly. So here you can see he's using 2 bowls to do this, but I recommend using 3 bowls instead. This allows you to break each egg over its own bowl to prevent any yolk from contaminating the entire bowl of egg whites. So to beat the egg whites, you can use any electric mixer. You can also beat them by hand if you have an arm with enough stamina. Now, Chef Ludo is going to add the sugar to the egg whites in 2 portions. You can add the sugar all at once to the egg whites, or you can add it in portions as you are beating them. You do want to make sure, however, that the granulated sugar is fully dissolved. So adding the sugar early on will ensure that, and also using an extra fine or superfine sugar is best for that as well. Now, once the sugar is added, keep beating the egg whites until they reach stiff peaks, ensuring they are as full of air as possible. Now, one recommendation here, as Chef Ludo does not include it in his recipe, if you have difficulty beating the egg whites correctly and find they break down, which can occur if you overbeat them, just add cream of tartar to the egg whites before beginning to beat them. This is basically insurance that the egg whites will not break down and will stay moist and glossy, so I highly recommend that. So just to back up a little bit, on screen here, Chef Ludo is pointing out that the egg whites have a characteristic that in French is described as bec d'oiseau, which means that the tip of the egg whites turn down just a little bit like a bird's beak, which is a good indicator that they are beaten properly. Chef Ludo now adds the egg yolks to the meringue. Now, why are the egg yolks added to the meringue? Egg yolks are simply going to enrich a chocolate mousse, and many chocolate mousse recipes do use egg yolks. By the way, if you want to try a mousse that I've translated that omits the yolks, I'll put a link to that video at the end of this one. When yolks are added into a chocolate mousse, they are typically added into the ganache, but Chef Ludo here mentions that his approach is to incorporate them into the meringue instead, because if you add the yolks to the ganache, that thickens the ganache more, possibly making it more difficult to incorporate the meringue. So instead, he adds the yolks to the meringue to make it easier. Chef Ludo has taken a moment here to answer what he says is a common question. Since the eggs in this recipe are not cooked, does this pose a risk? He goes on to explain that when we make mayonnaise, for example, the eggs are not cooked, so the risk, in his opinion, is very minimal, and in my opinion, it's very minimal as well. But check out my note in the description box below this video for more information regarding the eggs. So the egg yolks are now added, and he uses the mixer to blend them in thoroughly to the meringue. Mix them just long enough to get them incorporated, and again, try not to overmix this. It's time now to put this together, and one of the first points that Chef Ludo is making is that it's really important to make sure that the ganache has cooled down well enough to avoid the meringue breaking down as you incorporate it into the ganache. And if you remember, he suggested a temperature of around 40 degrees Celsius. I want to point out one thing here as he is pouring the ganache into the bowl, and if you look closely, you can see that the ganache is slightly broken or separated. My guess is that the ganache actually began to crystallize while he was completing the remaining portion of the recipe, and that's probably because of the timing of the video itself. but you can see that there's a little bit of oiliness to the ganache, but just barely. And that oiliness can be an indicator that the ganache is not fully emulsified. So if you do see any sort of weird textures with your ganache, then simply warm it up to the suggested temp and stir it or whisk it briefly to get it back smooth and creamy again before adding the meringue. It's time to add the meringue. He's going to first add just a small amount, about 1/3 of the meringue into the ganache, and that's because doing it this way will make it much easier if you lighten the ganache base first to incorporate the remaining meringue. So he's showing here the correct texture at this stage, if the ganache was at the correct temperature as well. He adds the remaining meringue into the bowl, and as you incorporate this, be sure to fold delicately to maintain the lightness of the mousse. Overfolding too much here can start to deflate the mixture. So you see that he's using this familiar gesture of turning the bowl in the opposite direction of the spatula, and that gesture is going to make kind of a hook shape with the spatula as it goes around the bowl, scraping the sides and fully incorporating the meringue. It's important to do this while also maintaining the lightness of the mixture, so again, be careful not to overdo this. As soon as no meringue is visible, you are done. So Chef Ludo explains that for serving this, you have a few options, one being to place the mousse into a large bowl and then serve it family style, or you can dispense it into individual serving glasses or bowls. And remember that chocolate mousse is rich, so small servings can go a long way. He's chosen a pastry bag to dispense this into his glasses, and that's perfectly fine, of course, but I have mentioned before that it's very easy to compress a chocolate mousse if using a pastry bag, so just be aware of that. If you want to lower that risk, just pour it into serving bowls or glasses using a beaker with a spout. It's now time to allow the mousses to set, and Chef Ludo is suggesting a minimum of 5 hours for the mousse to reach its fully set texture and the complete crystallization of the chocolate. Sometimes you can get away with less time if you're in a hurry, but it's best to plan well ahead, a few hours or the day before, to ensure your mousse is properly set. Because mousses are creamy, a lot of people do enjoy crunchy elements of some kind added to them. So he's going to use a microplane grater to microplane a bar of dark chocolate on top for appearance and some additional texture and chocolate flavor. So I hope you enjoyed learning about Chef Ludo's chocolate mousse technique. If you want to compare this to another chocolate mousse, watch my translation of Philippe Contaccini's iconic chocolate mousse. I'll put a link to that video on the screen here. That way you can practice both and choose a favorite. Please leave any comments or questions in the comment section below. I'll be happy to help you out more there, and I'll see you in the next video.